I want to imagine that I'm a reporter, and it's decades, maybe even centuries in the future, and I want to share with you a historical event, a time when the good news of God was proclaimed. So, this is what I say. I want to put it in a historical context, of course, because context is important. And so this is what I say. I say in the 4th year of the presidency of Barack Obama, when John Kasich was governor of Ohio, when Rob Portman and Sherrod Brown were senators of Ohio, when John Boehner was the Speaker of the House, and when Pope Benedict was the head of the Catholic Church, and Mark Hansen was the presiding bishop of the ELCA, at that time, the word of the Lord came to Deb in Akron, Ohio. Okay. Now, other than giving you a good idea that the event which I'm describing occurred in 2012, which you could surmise from the various clues that I've given in my listing of prominent people. What else does introducing what happened in that way imply? It implies, as I named those 7 prominent people who are alive and doing important things in 2012, it implies that Deborah here also is important. Why else would I name her with the important people of our day? And not only is she important, but what she's doing, which is what? Proclaiming the word of the Lord, is important. Well, that's exactly what the writer of Luke was attempting to do in today's gospel lesson, which poor Melissa had to read. All those various procurators and governors with their long names. He was attempting to say that this odd fellow named John the Baptist has been called by God to proclaim the word of the Lord. And he is as important, if not more important, than all of the prominent people that also were named. Now, John, who is, we might call him the advance man for Jesus. John is no one from nowhere. That's absolutely true. And yet, isn't it interesting that now, thousands of years later, it's all those other 7 VIPs who are in the footnotes of John's story and of the story of Jesus. So, if John, who is no one from nowhere, could be chosen by God rather than all the important people of his day, if John, who comes out of the wilderness, not out of Rome, not out of Jerusalem, could be chosen by God to proclaim the word of the Lord, then I think that means that Deb, or any of us, could be chosen to do that as well. Are chosen to do that as well. We are the advance people for Jesus. But what's our message? Well, I think we take a hint from John the Baptist as we try to figure out our message as well. The first thing we have to realize is that in the Gospel of Luke, as Luke introduces John the Baptist, he uses imagery from the prophet Isaiah. And the image is of a road being built, of all the obstacles being pushed aside so that people can go forward on this road to a new and better place. Now, when the prophet Isaiah spoke those words, he was talking about the people of Israel who were being held captive in Babylon, coming out of captivity and returning on that road back to Jerusalem. But when Luke uses that imagery about John, he's saying that John is going to clear the way for Jesus. Prepare the way for Jesus. And that Jesus will be the way to God. And this is a cataclysmic, how do you say that word? Cataclysmic, thank you. I should try to say words I can't say. Cataclysmic event. Just look at the imagery. Mountains are being knocked over. Valleys are being filled. So that the road is straight and smooth and anyone can travel on it. Did you notice the very last words of the gospel lesson today? So that all human beings can experience the glory of God, the salvation of God. So what's the message here? The message is this is an astounding, amazing, earth-shaking event that's going to happen. That Jesus is coming, and Jesus is going to open up the way for all people, not just one small group of people, for all people to God. And particularly for those people who feel alienated or separated or unworthy. Anything that's getting in their way is going to be removed. Now, shouldn't that be our message too? We're the advanced people for Jesus. And so our message is the road is clear, that there's no obstacles in any of our lives that can keep us from reaching God. Let me give you an example. And this is a pretty extreme example, but a true one. A few weeks ago, Pastor Sandy Selby and Pastor Carolyn and I all went to the same workshop on the role of spirituality in healing. And it was at Children's Hospital, and the person who presented it was Dr. Kenneth Pargaman, who is a PhD. He's done a lot of work on the connection between healing and spirituality. Excellent speaker. And so as a part of his presentation, he gave a case study. And the study was about a young woman named Rachel. And I'm not going to go into all the details of the study. But it started out with the fact that she came to him because she was extremely depressed, extremely isolated, physically unwell. And the feeling was that the reason for her mental crisis and emotional crisis was that she had been attacked by a violent gang. So, for many, many months, this conversation went on between her and the therapist. And finally, she revealed the fact that when she was 14 years old, she had made a choice. Now, I really doubt from the way the story was told that it was a choice, but she felt she had made a choice that, in her mind, was unforgivable. And she believed that her church, which was the Roman Catholic Church, viewed the choice that she had made as unforgivable. And she further believed that because of that choice, she was being punished. That every negative thing that had happened to her since then, including particularly the loss of her beloved grandmother and her being the victim of violence, were all the way that God was punishing her for this choice she had made. She believed that there was no way that she could ever be forgiven. And so, of course, that just furthered the spiraling down into the depression. Well, Dr. Pargaman decided that he would consult with a priest colleague of his to find out if this choice she had made, and I put choice in quotes because the story sounded to me like it wasn't a choice, but in any case, he decided to consult with a priest and asked, does the church really view this as an unforgivable sin? And the priest said, well, no, the church views it as being very serious, but not unforgivable. So during their subsequent therapy sessions, he began to introduce this concept that indeed she could be forgiven for this choice that she had made. And she became furious. She believed that no, she could not be forgiven. And she spewed out all this anger toward God, toward the church, no anger toward those who had hurt her, all toward herself and the choice she had made, and then toward God and toward the church. Well, the conversation continued. And then an interesting thing happened. After she had talked about her anger and her self-hatred, she somehow found herself one Sunday in the neighborhood of the church that she had attended as a child with her grandmother. And somehow she parked her car and she went in. She said she almost turned around and left because she felt so unworthy. But she felt the presence of her grandmother so strongly that she stayed. She felt as if her grandmother was sitting there talking to her, she said, and saying, it's all right, you can be here. Well, from there, things sort of unfolded. She went back to church. She started meeting with the priest, who was an extremely attentive and thoughtful man. She eventually received the sacrament of reconciliation and then Holy Communion. And then she joined the choir, which became a community of support for her. And she was transformed. It was as if all the obstacles that had kept her from the love of God were removed. And she began to heal. Now, there are several important advanced people for Jesus in that story. The therapist was one. That thoughtful and intentional priest was one. The choir who welcomed her and made her feel a part of the group are others. They were the advanced people for Jesus. They opened up the way for her to get to Jesus, who was the source of her healing. And that's who we are. We are the advanced people for Jesus. When people feel as if they're in the wilderness and there's no way out, our job is to help them see that there's a road out of that darkness and into the light of Christ. You know, one of my favorite sayings, and I say this all the time to people, so I may have said it to you, is, this too shall pass. The older you get, the more true that is, you know? That what you think is a horrendous situation today, a week from now, 2 weeks from now, 6 weeks from now, a year from now, looks completely different. Or as Dr. David Lose, who's a seminary professor, says, all of those challenges that we face are the footnotes of a larger story of God's love, mercy, and grace. I love that. Are the footnotes of the largest story of God's love, mercy, and grace. But here's the problem. At the time, the footnotes don't feel like the footnotes. Or as Dr. Loos puts it, we may not be made miserable by the emperor, as was true of the Jews in the first century to whom John the Baptist was preaching, but maybe we're made miserable by an unhappy marriage or by a difficult work situation. And we may not be oppressed by the Roman procurator, but we could be oppressed by addiction. And we may not be challenged by the governor. I wish Randy was here. He works for the governor. I could have said he is, but the rest of us aren't. We may not feel challenged by the governor, but no doubt we sometimes feel challenged and lost and alone in the midst of our lives at work or at home or at school. And we may not feel judged by the religious leaders or the scribes as the Jews did in that day, but perhaps we feel overwhelmed and judged by ourselves, or due to depression or shame. And in the midst of all that, the highway is open. And at various times in our lives, depending on what's happening for us, we are the advanced people who tell others the way to God is clear, or we need to hear that message ourselves. And transformation is possible. This too shall pass. So let me go back to where we started. In the fourth year of the presidency of Barack Obama, when John Boehner is Speaker of the House, when Rob Portman and Sherrod Brown are senators, when Pope Benedict is the leader of the Roman Catholic Church, when John Kasich is the governor of Ohio, when Mark Hansen is the presiding bishop of the ELCA, the word of the Lord has come, is coming to all of us in Akron, Ohio. And here's the interesting thing. The word of the Lord will last, will endure. And all those people that I just listed will become footnotes. Amen.